Dear son, my 2-year-old bundle of joy, I want to say that I love you. I want you to know that I always will love you. It must be a little weird to read this in English and not Portuguese. But the first time this letter was ever read out loud was before our extended Shai Tefillah family on a Rosh Hashanah evening. Before you were able to even understand all of these words, and you weren't even present because your bedtime was still 7 o'clock. I also want you to know that this idea to write a letter for you came from another father who wrote his own letter that then became a book to his son. This letter will not compare to that one, and it is not meant to do so. That letter will always be imprinted in my memory and in my heart. And you should read it too, if you haven't already. Knowing your Ima, your mom, I wouldn't be surprised if we gifted you with this book even before you got to Harry Potter or whichever crazy tale of magic and dragons is trendy by the time that you learn how to read. Nevertheless, sometimes I go off in a tangent. Please read the book that I was mentioning, and that book is called Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Ta-Nehisi tells his son about the hardship, although his son already knows some about it, of living in a black body in America. He speaks to his son directly about his own story, about the perils of being a young black boy, of having to be, as he says, twice as good, and to take responsibility for the action of other black people, of having to know and follow the rules, of having to struggle more than everyone else. Your life is much better, son. And that, son, is because just like me, you are white. I have an accent. I'm Latin. I'm an immigrant and a Jew. And sure, there are times that it's rough to be those things. But I still am aware of the ways in which being white makes my life unfairly easier. And this is why I couldn't even try to compare this letter to Ta-Nehisi's. And that's important for you to know. And I am writing you this letter for you in Rosh Hashanah, a season of reflection on what the year was like, on what our individual and collective actions in that year were like, on how our world looks like. A season of reflection and judgment, contemplation and atonement. I want to reflect with you, to contemplate what this recent time has been like. Son, when you were just 2 weeks old, your Ima remembers holding you tight in her arms when news came in of a mass shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, in an African-American church. Many were murdered, and the murderer's confession made it possible for investigators to call what happened in Charleston a hate crime. And when you were a little more than a year old, our country seemed to change a lot. America felt divided. People started to express fear, anger, and anxiety about what was going on in our country. Some say 77%, others say up to 86% of people in our country felt a stronger division in 2017 than ever before. First, I want to tell you that the division is just not new. The internal struggles of our society are not new. If you read Between the World and Me, you know that already. In some way, prejudices became a little more self-evident, and a whole part of the country for whom the colors blue, red, and purple have not had any real meaning whatsoever for many decades and many presidential mandates of presidents of all sides of the spectrum, instead of having their suffering finally heard, were called uneducated and unintelligent. And that based on how they recently voted. And a lot of latent hate that was already there, came to the surface. White supremacists marched in Virginia, passing by a synagogue just like the one from our Shai Tefillah extended family, screaming, "Jews will not replace us." Hatred seemed to be sanctioned and normalized. Son, my 2-year-old bundle of joy, your heart is already so clearly kind. Good, funny, silly, beautiful. I know it must be so hard to know that there is hate. Remember, hate always existed. It seems only to be a little more public, less apologetic on one side, more apologetic, but yet still existent on the other side. There's so much work left. I know it's unfair. I wish it was different. But I don't think you will live in a world of compassion and kindness only. I think the journey is long, very long, and it breaks my heart knowing that I can't deliver that to you. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, I know, you hear me quoting him all the time. But what can I do? He's always right. He once said, a religious man is a person who holds God and man in one thought at one time, at all times, who suffers harm done to others, whose greatest passion is compassion, whose greatest strength is love and defiance of despair. Son, we cannot despair. We have to have compassion as our greatest passion. I want to tell you a story that will help me to express what I'm trying to express. You may have heard the story before. You know me, I can sometimes be a little repetitive with the stories that I love. A professor walks into a classroom and places a jar on the table. She silently places rocks in the jar until no more can fit. She asks the class if the jar is full, and they agree that it is. She then pulls out a pile of small pebbles, adding them to the jar, allowing them to fill the spaces between the rocks. She asks again, is the jar full? Now they agree. Next, she adds sand to the jar, filling the space between the pebbles. Let's just go crazy. She asks again, is the jar full? This time the class is divided. Some feeling that the jar is obviously full, and some know that it's obviously a trick. So she grabs a pitcher of water. And the water fills the gaps in between the sand, the pebble, and the rocks. She then says, if this jar is your life, what does this experiment show you? So she explains the rocks represent the big things in life, what you will value at the end of your life, what you can't live without. Your closest loved ones, your values, all of the things you just can't live without. The pebbles are the other things in your life that give meaning to it, like your job, your house, your hobbies, your friendships. The sand and water represent the small stuff, clutter that fills your time, such as TV and internet, to name a few. Looking out at the class again, she asks, can you see what would have happened if I started with the sand and the pebbles? There would simply be no room for the big rocks. You see, my 2-year-old bundle of joy, this is all about priorities. You are a big rock for me. Your imma is too. Judaism is one as well. After all, I'm a rabbi. But I think we need to make sure that something else is a big rock for us. And for everyone we are able to inspire and work with. And that is the rock of compassion. Compassion is an overly used word. It sometimes is interchanged with the word empathy. Empathy is when you can see yourself in someone else's shoes. Remember, like when you were 2 and you learned the word no. And then you learn to respect, sometimes, when someone else says no. You learn what it means to be heard and respected and hear and respect back. Compassion is when not only we put ourselves in someone else's shoes and notice their suffering, but we also act to mitigate that suffering. Like when you were 2. And after you heard you gave someone an ouchie, you came with a serious, concerned face and gave a kiss to make it all better. So on the high holidays, we read the 13 attributes of God. The first of them is compassion. El Rachum Vechanun, God who is compassionate and merciful. Rabbi Alshich in the 16th century wrote that the commandment is not to say Yomru, the 13 attributes, it is to do, Ya'asu. We are commanded to do God's attributes. It's not enough that we say these words, that God is compassionate. We have to do them. We have to enact God's compassion, to become compassion, to become the big rock of compassion. And that's the work that can be the most transformative. We need to make compassion the hugest of all rocks. Because, my sweet child, the world needs it. America needs it. And of course, Ta-Nehisi Coates expressed what we deep down already knew. We have always been far from achieving a society of love alone. A society that feels united, all of its pieces, its diversity, its explosion of differences, respected on the same level. Michael Gellert, a renowned Jungian psychologist, wrote a book called The Fate of America, an inquiry into national character. In this book, he calls for the need of a spiritual renaissance in America. He calls us to respond to the erosion of the sense of a national purpose, when purpose becomes sand or even water. He says that Adams, one of our founding fathers, already had a vision that included the need for our personal interior integrity. America was founded with the idea of more than just a common national fate, but a common purpose. A person seeing the other person as a vital part of society. The way we behave towards the other will be reflected, Gellert says, in our institutions and our culture. This is why compassion needs to be a big rock. Son, I don't know if you remember, but in August of 2017, I traveled to D.C. to participate in a march. I joined a group of about 3,000 ministers to mark the anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We joined to commemorate the speech and to recommit as faith leaders to protect civil rights. One of the most impactful parts of the trip were the stories I heard from ministers from all around the country. I want to share one of them with you. I met a reverend who served nearby Richmond, Virginia. He told me that in Richmond, there is an avenue called Monument Avenue, displaying statues memorializing Virginian Confederate participants of the Civil War. Most of those monuments in Monument Avenue were built during the Civil Rights Movement and not before. They were built to instill fear and pain. They were built to create tensions. And he spoke of those tensions in his community today. New and old, he spoke of pain, he spoke of violence committed against his community at an ascending rate. He spoke of hatred, and to my surprise, he spoke of love. Really? Love? I asked. How can you speak of love? They live in darkness, they live in pain, he said. And we have to love them. I admit I was a little surprised. Can I love a neo-Nazi? Can I love an anti-Semite? Can I love a white supremacist? How on earth can I love the person holding a gun just across the street from the synagogue, like they did in Charlottesville, in a direct threat to the Jewish community trying to pray on Saturday morning. Meant to bring forth the despair that Abraham Joshua Heschel so much opposed. The Rabbi told me, you have to. He taught me that love is not complacency. Love is not complacency. Love is a way to find the good, to search for humanity even in our enemy. And then from that love, still stand up to the one who hates you. Resistance becomes sacred when we see the other as human, when we learn that the other has fears, insecurity, suffering. That suffering originates hate. And we need to understand that we never take that in a complacent way. We still fight hate because we have to. Remember that we are fighting brothers and sisters, estranged brothers and sisters. And perhaps by loving the other, we become less like strangers. Perhaps by loving them, we can feel a resistance as an act of love for us, for them, for the world. Another great rabbi of the 16th century, the Maharal of Prague, said, "Love of all creatures is also love of God, for whoever loves the one God loves all the work that God has made. When one loves God, it is impossible not to love all of God's creatures." The opposite is also true. If one hates the creatures, it is impossible to love the God who created them. The Maharal of Prague taught me that. Abraham Joshua Heschel taught me that. That Reverend from Virginia taught me that. And you, my child, always teach me. Building a rock of compassion is an imperative for the future. Son, my big rock, we are going to need to help one another in building this big rock of compassion. It's so hard at times. We will have to be more aware of the ways we may inflict in the world suffering, even without knowing. We need to love, see ourselves in the other, and wish to mitigate the suffering of all living beings. You and I are the other. We are the Jew that first came to one of the Americas escaping hatred in Europe. We are the trans person who cannot use the restroom he, she, they prefer to use. We are the black person who is stopped by the cop for a broken taillight only to be murdered. We are the undocumented immigrant. We are the woman who got 79 cents of salary for each dollar that we make as men. The person with a pre-existing condition that may in the future again not be able to get health care coverage in America. And we sometimes are the ones with stereotypes and prejudices. We need to remember that we are just as human as the poor of all colors, including the poor white from the Rust Belt, no matter how they voted in these last elections. We are the same as the ones ignored by politics of all trends. We not always mean unconditional love when we say love. To love everyone, and to build our big rock of compassion, we're going to have to learn their stories and share ours. We have to be acquainted with the other, no matter who the other is. And why? Because, son, I love you. I love life. I love people. I love being alive, being able to breathe and think about who I am, who I want to be, who I ought to be, who we ought to become, who you want to be, who we as a country are. And we can do much better than we've done. All of us, you and me. Even before this last year, even before you were born, even before the United States existed in my life. In Judaism, we speak of one of the thrones in which God sits to rule the world as Kisei Rachamim, the throne of compassion. Just like with the attributes, that we are not merely commanded to say that God is compassionate, but we are commanded to be compassionate as God is. I want to tell you that the High Holy Days are here to agitate us, to build our own chairs of compassion with our bare hands. Son, do you remember how during the High Holy Days I always like to give people a tchotchke, a souvenir to take home to remember my sermon, right? Maybe a bracelet, maybe something else. When I wrote this letter, and I read it first before our Shai Tefillah family, what people didn't know, or maybe at this point already figured out, is that I had put something, well, the amazing maintenance staff had put under people's chairs or where the prayer books go, the tchotchke for this year. A green rock. Not trash. A green rock. A green rock for each person. You have to hear the explanation, otherwise you know that you got a rock, but you don't know why. We'll find you one if you don't find it. A green rock for each person to take home and remind themselves to make compassion their big rocks. And remind themselves to make compassion an intrinsic part of our lives. Green on purpose, to symbolize growth, our capacity to cultivate, to let compassion sprout inside of us. And they are conveniently enough the right size to be carried in a pocket, as a daily reminder of the need to be compassionate, to make compassion a big rock. And there's something else. There's something else. These rocks are special. The rocks that they got were very, very special. If left in the sun during the day, they would absorb energy and shine with light in the dark when it's night. If we want, son, if we dare to love everyone, and I mean everyone, if we dare to resist with love and compassion, if we resist hate, bigotry, racism, inside and outside of us, we too will shine in the darkness. It's all a matter of choice. Son, I am sorry that the world you were born into is not one of compassion, of unconditional love. I'm sorry I can't do that for you. You know there is nothing in the world that I wouldn't do for you if I could. I knew this was going to be hard. But remember, we have the capacity of loving, caring and becoming bearers of compassion. And son, I hope and pray from the depths of my heart that you will choose, because it is a choice, to continue to grow your little heart in the same amazing way you have done so far, and become a loving and compassionate person. I love you.